Do you ever come across a film so aggressively vacuous that says nothing so loudly it essentially becomes impossible for you to ignore? Well, for me, that film is The Green Inferno. I'm not saying it's a bad movie, though it probably is, or even that it's an offensive movie, though it definitely is. My issue isn't with the film's problematic material, though we'll talk about that, or even with the way it was marketed, which I wasn't even aware of until I started writing this video. No, my issue with The Green Inferno is that it's vapid, and it insists upon its own vapidity in a way that's virtually impossible to disregard. Now, when I say the film says nothing, I am being a bit hyperbolic. It does try to say some things, just in a way that's incoherent and often self-contradictory. The Green Inferno is both Eli Roth's love and hate letter to the Italian cannibal boom films of the 1970s and 80s, an offshoot of the exploitation cinema scene we talked about in my Death Proof video. Something my friend Style as Substance pointed out to me is that the film has a kind of animal-loving agenda. The only meat we see eaten is human flesh, and while the Americans are locked in a pig pen, there are farm animals grazing peacefully in the open air or treated as domestic pets. I think this is responding to films like Mountain of the Cannibal God or Cannibal Holocaust, which were known for featuring the unsimulated mutilation or slaughter of live animals. The first activist executed in the Green Inferno is killed in a way that mirrors a turtle being slaughtered in Cannibal Holocaust, for example. I don't believe Eli Roth is a vegan himself, but there is a kind of anti-meat through line to his work, and he directed and shot an anti-violence PSA for PETA a few years back, though I have to say his involvement with that particular charity makes his critiques of campus activism a bit rich, given their mission statement seems to be draw attention by any means necessary.
That's the only way people change their behavior. The threat of embarrassment. You must shame them.
The premise of the film is thus. A bunch of liberal college students travel to the Amazon ostensibly to protect natives from being violently displaced for oil extraction, but really for social media clout, only to wind up being tortured, killed, and eaten by the very people they're trying to help. And if that sounds like jerk-off material for the most annoying anti-SJW edgelord haunting your timeline 5 years ago, that's exactly what it is. The film's primary criticism is of what you could call slacktivism, people who wrap themselves up in a cause for social media cred rather than out of principles or a genuine desire to do good. And for sure, this is a real thing. You see this on YouTube all the time, where people will create content of a specific political bent while they're in the process of trying to build a career. So it's like, there's always this question of whether a content creator really believes the things they're saying, or they just want to be seen saying it. And I think people who do this for a living do have a certain propensity for self-absorption. You almost have to. To give you an example of what I'm talking about, I might have been more viscerally annoyed by the film's depictions of college-educated American progressives than with how the natives were portrayed, and that is some serious narcissism right there. I like the final shot of the film with Alejandro's face on the t-shirts like the Che Guevara thing because, again, this is very YouTube, where people will put popular figures on a pedestal and form personality cults, often with unreasonable expectations of the central figure. But I don't think The Green Inferno makes a very coherent criticism of activist circles, to be honest. Some of the observations it makes about human nature are accurate, but I don't think they're relegated to any particular social sphere, and in large part it feels like The Green Inferno is responding more to the exaggerated social justice warrior parody of activism that was being pushed by mostly right-wing content creators, mostly right here on YouTube. And I don't think this was an environment that Eli Roth was unexposed to at the time. Indeed, a lot of the film's marketing seems to be focused specifically on that audience. There was a Facebook ad linking a Breitbart article by Milo Yiannopoulos, a poster showing a severed human hand holding a phone with a bunch of activist-sounding hashtags, including Social Justice for All, Jungle Gate, and Native Lives Matter. Then there was this 24-hour period where the director retweeted the Killstream guy who doxed Brianna Wu, the Baldwin who started the Gamergate hashtag tweeting about Zoe Quinn, and of course the meme himself, all while marketing the movie.
You know, I really noticed Occupy Wall Street was the first moment when, as it was spreading, it starts off as this hugely important cause, this kind of tipping point in culture, and all of a sudden there's a relative of mine that had graduated college and wasn't working because he was occupying, and I was thinking like, well, I don't know how the banks ever fucked him over, and maybe he feels it's wrong, but I got the sense that he was going there because his friends were doing it and they were meeting girls, and that was like fun to occupy. Yeah. And that's the kids in Green Inferno. these, and this whole culture of social justice warriors evolved, that everyone, then it starts with Gamergate or SJWs, or, okay, you tweeted this, you must hate women.
Now, part of this is obviously about selling tickets. Anti-SJW content was hot at the time, and exploitation cinema has always been exploitative, but I think there's also a certain sense of gravitas people will assign to works of art considered controversial or dangerous, and this was an attempt to tap in on that. I really don't think Eli Roth was trying to make a movie that demonizes indigenous people. The film is certainly more on the side of the cannibals than the construction crews and armed militia. Honestly, I feel like I'd almost like the movie a little bit more if it were some reactionary screed like God's Not Dead or You're Giving Clint Eastwood piece of shit, because then I could at least laugh at how over-the-top sinister Alejandro is depicted, rather than frustrating myself trying to figure out what the hell kind of point Roth was trying to make.
The idea that a fictional movie about a fictional tribe could somehow hurt indigenous people when gas companies are tearing these villages apart on a daily basis is simply absurd. These companies don't need an excuse. They have one. The natural resources in the ground. They can window dress things however they like, but nobody will destroy a village because they didn't like a character in the movie. They'll do it because they want to get rich by draining what's under the village. This fear that somehow a movie would give them ammunition to destroy a tribe all sounds like misdirected anger and frustration that the corporations are the ones controlling the fates of the uncontacted tribes by manipulating the governments into changing the laws. It's like saying movies cause violence, which if that were true, then violence would not have existed before the Melee brothers. The whole idea of the kids saving the rainforest only to be eaten by the tribe they saved is a metaphor for how people are shamelessly consumed by their vanity and need for validation on social media. These kids in the movie care, but they care more about getting recognized for caring.
The marketing for the film aside, I do believe Roth is being genuine here, but there's also a certain naivete to the sentiment he's trying to express, however earnest he might be. It's true, indigenous people aren't being displaced and murdered because of unflattering depictions in film, but it's also true that the media we consume affects the public consciousness, and demonization of indigenous people in the public consciousness can contribute to the sort of apathy that makes it easier for capitalists to steal their land and resources. This is something propagandists have always employed to dehumanize the marginalized in the eyes of the majority, and I don't see how Eli Roth could possibly be unaware of this. I mean, he mentions having pulled from Leni Riefenstahl's photos of Africa and designing the natives, which, if nothing else, is a strange name to drop while promoting your movie.
It's not something that can be cured overnight.
Unless there was oil involved. Then we'd end up GM tomorrow.
Word so simple.
You know, most of the time when people talk about cancel culture, they're coming at it from the perspective of a political reactionary, but there is an artistic element to it as well, a natural creative aversion to the idea that some art is too problematic or damaging and shouldn't be seen. And that's certainly a more worthy reason to feel averse to this sort of thing than the general disdain for progressivism that's usually behind most complaints about cancel culture or leftist film criticism. That might even be something I'm a little sympathetic to myself. Part of the reason I felt the need to cover some of the things I have on this channel is that there is a propensity in leftist media circles to demonize art that's seen as containing problematic material. You take something like 300, which is often accused of being reactionary propaganda when the film is in fact an examination of propaganda. The Persians in 300 are demonized not unlike the way the natives are demonized in Green Inferno, but when you really look at the Persian army, a large, wealthy invader, vastly peopled, sexually decadent, and with military technology the Greeks don't have access to, doesn't that seem more like the United States than modern-day Iran? This isn't to say 300 doesn't contain racism, nor that it shouldn't be criticized for its problematic depictions of Middle Eastern people, but these same elements were present in Lord of the Rings just a few years earlier, minus the introspection that 300 invites, and those films aren't nearly as often criticized for it.
Wicked men, servants of Sauron.
A lot of the fantastical elements in 300 are also shown over narration by a character who, we find out in the end, is telling a story to other Greek soldiers, getting them hyped up to fight the Persian army. So it's like, maybe he has an interest in presenting the story with a certain bias? The natives in Green Inferno are exactly what they appear to be, a very authentic depiction of a real Amazon tribe interlaced with the ugliest, most racist stereotypes applied to them in Western media. The actors drawn from an actual community of people who had never seen a movie before Roth showed them Cannibal cannibal holocaust and who had no idea what it meant for, say, their children to appear in a film like this and what sorts of audiences might be consuming it all over the world. I do think art should be protected, even offensive art, and indeed I think sometimes the job of the artist is to offend, but they have to do it in a way that says something for that to be valid, and for all it insists upon itself, I don't think the Green Inferno really has a discernible message. Whether it intends to or not, it does demonize the natives, it might demonize the activists even more, to be honest, and it's certainly not on the side of the militia either. It criticizes progressive organizing, but without offering any alternate model or thesis of its own besides a sort of general disengagement that only reinforces the status quo. It can't even claim to be an amoral celebration of horror because the film goes out of its way to politicize itself at every turn.
Is activism so freaking gay?
And ultimately, I feel like the only way to properly convey how little this movie says is by contrasting it with something that says more through a lot of the same material. Some of you may remember the first proper video essay I ever uploaded to this channel was about Bone Tomahawk. I took it down along with some of my other early videos because I wasn't entirely happy with the way some things were expressed, but I'll probably make them available for patrons in a few weeks. If you've seen that video, some of this might be repeated information, but as soon as it came to me to write about the Green Inferno, I knew I'd have to talk about Bone Tomahawk as well, because aside from there being some almost eerily similar plot details, both films employ more or less the exact same, what you could call problematic tropes, but in my opinion to drastically different effects. Now, one thing I want to clarify before we get into this, I'm not somebody who's going to have any more insight into racism than Eli Roth or S. Craig Zahler, and while I believe there's real artistic merit to Bone Tomahawk, it's not for me to say whether this redeems the film's racist elements. And I've seen more than one indigenous film critic express deep discomfort with some of the things we're about to discuss. There's really no way to depict indigenous Americans as cannibals without being at least a little bit harmful. I want to be clear about that. I'm not defending Bone Tomahawk's use of these tropes, I'm just pointing out some differences in the ways the film applies them as opposed to the Green Inferno. For one, while the antagonists are very much coded as indigenous North Americans and are all played by Native American actors, the film does take certain steps to distinguish them from real people, to make it clear this is a fantasy story.
Indians? Looks like it, but I don't reckon.
Man like you would not distinguish them from Indians, even though there's something else entirely.
The troglodytes, a Greek term meaning caveman, are just that. Hyper-masculine with this thing about penetration and a kind of phallic violence. Their entire social hierarchy seems to be based around killing, with no real language because all they need is that preternatural hunting call.
Well, I'm fairly certain I heard that sound back in Bright Hope on the night of the kidnapping.
Feels like a signal. Maybe an alarm. Inspect your firearms. We've been spotted.
When we finally see their women, it becomes clear that the troglodytes lost their way when they turned their back on femininity, removed women as a social force from their society. Everything about them is a critique of violent masculinity. Even the weapon they use, the titular Bone Tomahawk, is made from the jawbone of some kind of an equestrian animal, a horse or a donkey. This pretty overtly recalls the biblical story of Samson and Delilah, a parable which both upholds the virtues of manly violence and warns against the duplicitousness of women. The Bone Tomahawk itself referencing Samson's final stand at Iwo Jima, where he slew the entire army of the Philippines armed only with the jawbone of a donkey. The film is basically saying that everything good human civilization has ever produced, what brought us out of the caves, was our willingness to embrace the feminine aspects of our nature. When Lily and Nick were first taken, Sheriff Hunt looks to the mayor's wife to restore order rather than to the man himself, and the reason Lily was in that cell in the first place was because the town doctor was drunk. Then there's this scene that takes place after the horses are stolen, when the posse has to go on afoot.
Mr. O'Dwyer, that valley is at least a 2-day walk.
I'll try to match your pace. If I fall behind, I'll catch up when you sleep.
You watch the train now. There's one bad fall, you lose that leg.
Have you ever performed an amputation?
Yeah, in the war. But even done correctly, chances aren't good.
That seems like an especially miserable way to spend your final days.
The worst.
We get these long shots of Arthur limping down the mountain in the dark, crossing the plains and up another slope, his companions catching up, then passing him in a matter of moments. We keep waiting for him to fall and break his leg, to be attacked again, but it never happens. When he makes it to camp uninjured, it almost seems like a miracle, like their insane quest might have a happy ending after all. And then this happens.
we get there before you catch up. I'll try to refrain from flirting with Mrs. O'Dwyer.
Everywhere in the film, women are depicted as sources of wisdom and stability, with masculinity tied to violence and self-destruction.
This is why frontier life is so difficult. Not because of the Indians or the elements, but because of the idiots.
You shouldn't have shot that drifter back in Bright Hope and got my wife involved, and Bruder shouldn't have executed them Mexicans and made it all worse!
My favorite expression of this is through Matthew Fox's John Bruder, this pedantic asshole who keeps lecturing everyone on the cold utilitarianism of surviving the frontier, but every time his philosophy is put to the test, it just exacerbates their problems. He tells the others to shoot first if something activates his tripwire during the night, while announcing he'll almost certainly beat them to the draw, but then he fires blind into the dark and only wounds a coyote, which then keeps everyone awake with its whimpering. Then the next night he guns down 2 unarmed travelers, declaring them to have been robbers, but when highwaymen attack the safe camp he forces the others to move to, he's the one they get the drop on.
I'm the most intelligent man here, and I intend to keep us alive.
Oh, you're the most intelligent man here. Is that a fact?
It is. Sheriff Hunt has a wife. So does Mr. O'Dwyer. And you're a widower.
Yeah. What has that got to do with anything?
Smart men don't get married.
Declaring himself the smartest person in the group while tying that to a distrust of women, that is just classic YouTube shitlord behavior, and the guy's name is literally Bruder. He styles himself this big bad Indian killer, blaming his racial hatred on having seen his mother and sisters massacred in a raid, even while himself admitting to having killed native women and children. Then when the troglodytes finally attack, he's the last one to react and the first to go down. Losing a hand to the bone tomahawk, he declares his intent to kill as many troglodytes as he can before dying, setting himself up for some heroic final stand, but he botches even that, only killing a single enemy, which also kills him. Probably because he demands they leave him the repeating rifle, which requires 2 hands to aim and reload properly, instead of a revolver, which requires the one he had. But one of the things I really do love about this movie is that it manages to be as much a celebration of what you could call masculine virtues as it is the condemnation of preemptive violence and toxic masculinity. Lily gives up on survival before Hunt, and she kind of enjoys the sex more when Arthur's on top. Arthur's single-minded determination to rescue his wife, even at his own detriment, in that little Garden of Eden moment he has with the opium.
What do you see?
A snake. In a tree.
What kind?
Deceased.
The film explores all these different manly archetypes, the hunter, the brooder, the Arthurian white knight, but the one who makes it through mostly unscathed is Chicory, the old man who embraces passivity and seems defined more than anything else by how much he loves and misses his dead wife. Now, maybe it's unfair to compare 2 entirely unrelated movies in order to say one is more or less significant than the other. Different films say different things in different ways, but I really was struck with how similar, especially the last third of Bone Tomahawk, is to the Green Inferno. Both movies have groups of Americans captured by at least what seem to be indigenous people and locked in a pen like livestock to be eaten after a series of insanely grotesque executions. The Green Infernos might have been a little more difficult to watch just because of how long it went on for, but God damn, that was some grisly shit that happened to the deputy. Every time you think you know where they're going with it, it gets somehow worse. And both groups also try to poison their captors with drugs, only for it to horrifically backfire.
Wait! What? No. Oh. Fuck, they have the munchies! They have the munchies!
But is Bone Tomahawk really less racist than the Green Inferno? I don't know, maybe a little? But even if it is, it's still undoubtedly a racist movie. I'm not saying it shouldn't be seen, but it's something I'd definitely be more comfortable recommending to some people than to others. I still think there's tremendous artistic value to the movie. It certainly says something, but that doesn't mean it redeems the problematic tropes it employs in doing so. And the Green Inferno says things as well, to be sure, about animal cruelty, about the problematic nature of branding activism, and certainly about the cannibal exploitation films Eli Roth grew up on, but it's all scattershot. The film's ideas never come together to form any kind of coherent point. I'm not saying it should be burned or even that you shouldn't watch it. I recommend you watch it and form your own opinions, but sometimes when a film uses problematic tropes like this and garners criticism, the creative instinct we all have to protect art can dominate the conversation in a way that makes it very difficult to criticize the film on its own merits. That's probably why I find the 2 movies to be such a useful comparison. The Green Inferno tries to be a film that criticizes full of shit millennial progressives who want attention but don't really stand for anything, but it doesn't have a central thesis of its own to contrast them with, so the result is a full of shit movie that wants attention but doesn't really stand for anything. I'm sorry, it just is. Thank you for watching. And I'd especially like to thank Il Caesar, Dios, Aaron Black, Crown of Eyes, 4_, Sam Ratliff, Terrence Edwards, Durdya Zugme, Dominic Wiebenseal, David Thomas, Revan Crowley, Francis Foster, Rakafig, Donovan Reed, Machida49, and Jumbo Gines for supporting me on Patreon, as well as fellow YouTuber and filthy Green Inferno defender Style is Substance for lending her voice to the video. If you enjoy my work and would like to help me form my own cult of personality, you can do so by visiting patreon.com/wormshole.